For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing or reaping. So in this land that Joseph is in, it's been 2 years since this famine started, since there wasn't enough food to feed everyone, since people became hungry and couldn't get enough of what they needed. They're just 2 years into a 7-year famine, and people are going without, and they're really struggling to deal with the impact on themselves and their families and their communities that this famine has had. And it's so bad that all agricultural activity has basically ground to a halt. And for those of you from the prairies, I think of you, Cheryl, and Kathy, who's in Manitoba, the farm there, you know what this could actually mean for a society. And we want to remember that this is an agrarian society, so it's a society that really is based around agriculture. It's their main business, so it's their main economy, right? And what happens when the economy starts to slow down? I think of places like Alberta and how it affects people. So what was once a busy and bustling economy is now really struggling to survive. And the big thing here is that people can't get what they need, and let alone what they want. They're left to find any means necessary to survive, and so that means traveling long distances like Joseph's brothers to find food for their families, and they still have 5 more years of this to go. I mean, it's not only this, but because of all the disruption that's happening in their society, things that would have usually been happening throughout the year attached to agriculture wasn't happening, right? I mean, festivals, harvest festivals, Thanksgiving type things not happening, gatherings around planting and harvesting as well, not there. So community is being disconnected from each other in this space. It's being almost torn apart, somewhat like it's happening here in our own society to some degree. And similarly, life has sort of come to a standstill. It slows down. And regular activities like, the day-to-day routine that you have, it's not happening the same way. And people are thinking, what now? What's next for us? What are things going to be like? How am I going to adapt to this? How long is this going to be for? I have a good friend named Karen. She's from Saskatchewan. And we were talking about this passage and talking about farming. And she explained to me an interesting thing that I never really thought of, is that farmers always live with hope. They plant their seeds in the spring, and for the rest of the growing season, they kind of hope for something to happen, for something to grow and come to fruition. They hope for rain and sun. They hope that the right weather will be there when they harvest and that the frost won't come too soon. And when they harvest, they get seeds, and those seeds are meant for another season, right? And it carries them forward. But if there's no harvest, there's no seeds. And if there's no seeds, there's no planting. And if there's no planting, there's no hope for harvest. You can see the domino effect, right? No hope for food, survival, all of these things. What happens when your hope for the future starts to fade? I think that applies to us now. What happens when 2 years turns into 7 years more, or 7 years? Or what happens when 6 months of COVID turns into a year or 2 years? What happens when the world is kind of turned upside down and you're left kind of holding on for dear life to the things that are left desperately? And I think desperate is the word. We become desperate, don't we? We try to stay alive, to survive, to hold on to anything we can. We look for normalcy, like usually what was, because of the horror of the life that's around us, the things we don't want to see happening. I mean, no one really wants to wake up in the morning and look out the window and not recognize the view. It's disorienting and it's hard to make sense of, isn't it? Because we spend a lot of time as people making sense of the world, right? Making sense of what's happening around us and putting it together into something that we can live with. And sadly, it's often only when we become desperate that we step outside of that into something different. We often don't take those steps beforehand. Well, back to Joseph's story. I'm not sure how Joseph kind of convinced the Pharaoh, that's who he was kind of working for, or slave moved up, to store up all that grain. I mean, there was the dream that happened. There's a dream that happens, and Joseph kind of interprets this dream for Pharaoh, and Pharaoh sees, okay, there's a famine, and I guess he must have trusted Joseph to know that something was going to happen, that they needed to prepare for the change that was coming. And that's what Joseph was doing before the famine. He was preparing for the change that was coming, before the worst of it came, not while the worst of it was happening, but before the worst of it came, so that when it was time for them to hunker down, they were ready. So what he did is he stored up all this grain, like 7 years supply of grain for a whole country. I don't even know what that looks like. But he was spending this time getting ready, and I guess in my mind I wondered, what did people think about him getting ready for this, doing the things he needed to do? What did that look like for people? Did they balk at him? Did they laugh at him? Did they make fun of him? Getting ready for things before they happen is risky because we don't know if the thing is going to happen. I think we see some of that in the COVID right now. And then we look at Joseph a little more, and somehow, some way, after all that Joseph has gone through, right? And maybe because of all that he's gone through, he's been able to see this famine, but he's able to see things in a way that most people around him aren't able to see it. And it isn't just about preparing for a famine, although that's part of it. It's that Joseph is able to see the whole world in a way that many aren't. This gift that God has given him, it's almost a gift of hope that Joseph has in what would seem like a hopeless world. And its ability for Joseph to kind of taste goodness, the goodness that he sees around him, even when there's nothing to eat. I mean, how do you do that? How do you taste goodness when there's no food to taste? And so something amazing happens in the midst of this famine. In the midst of this famine, he meets his estranged family, this family that hasn't had any relationship for a long time, that's been broken to pieces. And for those who don't know, Joseph's brothers, they tried to kill him, right? And then they sold him into slavery. That's not something you easily get over. Joseph ends up working for Pharaoh, and he moves up the ranks and becomes a powerful person. And this is the Joseph that his brothers meet after all these years. And so you see that the tables have turned, right? Joseph is no longer in the pit that they would have thrown him in initially for him to die in, looking up at his brothers, but now he's looking down on them. Things have switched around. And I imagine Joseph struggling with what he should do with this situation, because it's the perfect setup. It's the perfect revenge setup if you really want one. They're begging for food, for their lives, just like Joseph would have been begging for his life in that hole. And they don't even know who they're asking, right? They don't even know it's Joseph, the one who they did this to. I mean, really, nobody knows these are his brothers, and he could have totally gotten away with it. He could have sent them away to die, and no one would have known what he would have done, and he would have got his revenge. And I'm sure this goes through Joseph's head. But somehow, in God, through God, Joseph sees and experiences possibility and hope in this situation. He knows somewhere deep down that God can make good out of the worst situations. And I know I've said that before, but that's one of the things, probably one of the greatest things about God, is that God can make good out of the worst situation. That God can feed our deepest hunger even when we're so hungry and desperate and we don't see food around us. So rather than getting revenge, right, or pushing his brothers away even, because he has every right to, for what they've done to him, he has every right to get rid of them. What are the words he says to them? He says, "Come close to me." And he weeps so loud for joy that the whole household of Pharaoh hears it. And so 2 years into a 7-year famine, this horrible situation, in desperate times of great change, God brings together this family once again and heals wounds of the past and opens them into a new way forward. It can be hard to see these things in the midst of famine or in the midst of COVID. It is difficult. So I got a couple questions. What are you hungering for in the midst of this COVID famine? Do you long for touch of another person, your grandchild, a friend, maybe your children? Do you want to taste the sweetness of relationship? Maybe you're single and you're kind of separated from people. It's difficult to be with others. Are you longing to kind of bite into the joy of maybe celebrating birthdays or weddings or dancing to music with friends and feeling energy around you? I think that everybody is hungry in a certain way right now in this world. Maybe it's not for food, but it's for some sort of emotional, relational pieces. And some of you may even be starving and feeling weak. I mean, we're 6 months in, right? And how much longer, we don't know. How many years until we can plant again, until we can harvest? We don't know, do we? We don't know. All we have today is this story, at least in front of us at this time, about Joseph. And he's a person who was almost killed by his own family, who was sold into slavery and lived through 7 years of a famine. He's a person who was asked to prepare, even though it didn't make any sense. Still did it. Person whose hope for reunification for his family was really dead. I mean, I imagine Joseph never expected to see them again. But behind all this brokenness, which is so easy to see, right? The brokenness is so easy to see. And you know the brokenness that I'm talking about in your own life and in the world. God is somehow quietly working. And in some ways it feels foolish to say that. God is doing something. Because the question always is God really doing something? Why isn't God doing this? Why isn't God doing what I want God to do or what we expect God to do? But somehow God doesn't work the way we think. And then suddenly, without warning, right, in a bleak time, a beautiful story can emerge, like Joseph's or many others if we look around at us. I mean, this could have ended in revenge and rejection. There was no reason for it to end the way it did, but it didn't. And it's this beautiful picture of long-lost siblings holding each other, right? It's the image of a family separated by time and space, looking into each other's eyes and knowing that the impossible is possible in God. I think most of the time we don't know what God is up to, even though we want to. But we do know that God is up to something. That God is up to something. God is weaving together, because that's what God does. God doesn't tear apart. God is weaving together. God is finding different ways to feed the hungry, to make sure those who don't have enough get what they need. And many times that is through us, right? That's our call. So as we continue through this time, as we are 6 months in, and we wonder how much more, may our hope in the future not rest in necessarily always what we can see, but may it rest in God and God's ability to do something, even if that seems almost impossible. Let it rest in the fact that God is doing something. And as my confirmation students called their board game, they made a board game, they called it God Did a Thing. And God is still doing a thing. And may God give us the eyes to see that all around us each day. Amen.